Hello and welcome to a Firstpost POV. Today we're talking about the escalating tensions in the Caribbean. Since early September, the United States military has carried out more than 24 airstrikes on so-called drug boats in the region, and these strikes have killed more than 100 people. And yesterday, the Trump administration went a step further, attacking mainland Venezuela for the first time in what they said was a port that was loading drugs onto these vessels. The question is, are Trump's actions legally backed? What does the international law say about them? And what is the international community doing to rein him in? Joining me now to discuss this situation is Professor Surya Deva, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development. Thank you so much, Professor, for speaking to us on Firstpost.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Now, a couple of days ago, UN experts, including yourself, condemned the blockade that was imposed by the Trump administration on sanctioned oil tankers that were leaving Venezuela. Now, in common parlance, we understand blockades to be a very obvious and common strategy in warfare. What does international law say about them, and why is Trump's blockade illegal?
U.S. government actions, as you mentioned, for the last several months are blatant violation of the UN Charter, because unilateral actions of this nature are not permitted under international law. And UN Charter is very, very clear on this, that territorial integrity of all states has to be respected, and there has to be non-aggression. And whatever threats the U.S. government has given, as well as they have attacked so many boats that has killed close to 100 people, the blockade of oil tankers, all these things constitute a clear breach of UN Charter in our assessment. And that's why we issued that statement about 1 week ago. But of course, it's quite concerning that despite those assessments on our part, U.S. government is continuing to escalate the particular situation. And we understand there has been a drone attack on the territory of Venezuela.
Right. Now, did your office or anybody from the United Nations or the other experts on the panel reach out to the U.S. government during the preparation of this report, or what has been their reaction, Washington's reaction to your condemnation and the statement that came out from your panel?
As part of this process, not a report, it's just a press release, but normally we do not issue a press release without contacting the relevant government authorities. So we did contact the relevant U.S. Government authorities. And normally how we operate is we contact the U.S. Counterparts based in Geneva, the ambassador or DPR of that particular person. So we normally send a communication first to the relevant government, and we give them an opportunity to explain the particular situation. Of course, we are monitoring the situation quite closely, but at the same time, we are quite concerned with how the US government is acting on this particular instance. This may create a situation of lawlessness. As all of us will recall, President Trump keeps claiming credit for building peace all over the world and ending wars. But these actions are a clear instance of disrupting peace in the region, and they are in a clear breach of the UN Charter in our assessment.
Just to probe a bit further, you did reach out to the UN ambassador in Geneva. Was there no response from Washington? Did they try to stonewall the press release or the statements that you were preparing?
No, I think normally we have the discretion. They cannot veto or stonewall the press release. But as per the standard practices, we give this advance notice to the relevant government authorities. As far as I understand, we have not received any communication or response from the US government at this particular point of time, which is not a surprise, because in the past also there have been instances where US government or other governments also, they don't sometimes respond to these communications.
Right. Now, despite...
I think that is in fact one of the reasons we go out public and issue a press release, because sometimes the behind the scene diplomacy and the confidential communication is not having that effect, and it's not attracting the attention of the government and the other actors. And that's why in our value judgment, sometimes we issue a press release and we go public.
Right. Like you mentioned, despite the criticism and that press release, the government of the United States has not stepped back. In fact, they've now moved a step further and struck Venezuelan territory and a port in Venezuela. Now, what is the next step for experts like yourself and the international community? Should we expect more public condemnations? What else can you do to enforce what you essentially said in that press release, that a blockade and these strikes are not legal according to international law?
I mean, we only have power of persuasion. So I think it should be understood that ultimately this is a political issue. States should come together collectively to deal with the situation, which is a unilateral sanction imposed on a sovereign state. If there are legitimate disputes between two countries, in this case, the allegations are about drug trafficking, for instance, they should be resolved in a peaceful manner. And this particular way of imposing unilateral blockade, imposing sanctions, attacking these boats and killing innocent people, or doing this drone strike within the territory of sovereign country, these are definitely not the ways how countries should be resolving their disputes. So we have power of persuasion. So we'll continue to engage the government of US as well as other actors and try to persuade and encourage them to not continue on this path, because this is going to destabilize the region and may trigger potentially more conflicts. Because if the idea is to create a more peaceful world, these actions are completely inconsistent with that particular idea. Of course, the Security Council can also act on situations like these, but unfortunately, a country like US has a veto power,
Yes.
and I do not expect the Security Council to take any decisive action on these particular instances. And I think that's where we need more long-term reform of the Security Council, that these illegal steps are curtailed in future.
Now, while studying this conflict and the strikes that have been happening since September, what did you make of the response of the United States and its allies, particularly who are in the Security Council, like the UK and France, or even other countries of the world? Their criticism, their position on these strikes, has that been insufficient in your assessment so far?
As far as I understand, at least two members of the Security Council, Russia and China, they have been critical of these steps on the part of the US government. But I have not heard very vocal positions taken by the other two members of the Security Council. And I think that has been perhaps the critical element of the current world situation in which we are living. In one of the reports that I authored in October and presented in October is that I'm talking about there is emerging world disorder. So it's not an one isolated instance. You can see illegal actions taken by the governments of multiple countries. We have highest number of conflicts the world is witnessing ever since the Second World War. And the U.S. government, as a major power, should behave more responsibly rather than taking these particular actions. So this is highly reprehensible, and it should be stopped, in my view.
Right. Now, in multiple statements, the US government has tried to defend what they're doing by saying this is self-defense, that Venezuela is smuggling drugs into the United States, they're sending illegal migrants across, they're funding narco-terrorists, and this presents a national security challenge to the United States. Does drug smuggling, even if confirmed, first of all, it's not been confirmed by the United States, but if it is confirmed, do the allegations reach the level for the United States to say that this is indeed self-defense?
I mean, self-defense is a very contextual articulation under international law. So definitely there can be situations in which self-defense may be triggered. But based on what we have seen so far, I don't think this can be regarded as a legitimate exercise of self-defense on the part of the US government. We should also bear in mind that self-defense is not a right without any limitations. There has to be a reasonable basis. The proportionate force has to be used, and you have to minimize the impact on civilians. And some of the attacks that we have seen on the boats are clearly targeting civilians close to 100 innocent people have lost their lives. So even if, for the sake of argument, if there is self-defense, I don't think that self-defense has been exercised properly by the U.S. government, and that is definitely again a violation of uh, international law as well as the UN Charter. In fact, if any country could exercise self-defense, it should be Venezuela rather than the U.S. government.
Right. That's a good point you make there. And I'd like to focus on one of the strikes that the United States conducted early on in September, which is being called a double tap. The United States knew that damage had been done, but another strike was ordered, possibly killing the survivors of that shipwreck. Now, even US officials admit that that could have been a possible war crime. That attack and the other attacks that we've seen since September, do they amount to crimes against humanity or war crimes in your assessment?
I mean, it is very difficult for me to make a ruling in this interview on this particular issue, but definitely based on the information that is available, these are very serious steps that the US government has taken. And in our assessment, there is a clear breach of international law on many counts. There is an aggression, there is a violation there. There is a disproportionate use of force, and I don't think there is a legitimate use of self-defense in any of those situations. And killing of innocent people is again a violation of international law. And of course, there is a potential breach of international criminal law as well, international humanitarian law as well. Of course, U.S. is not a party to the Rome Statute, and because of that, U.S. authorities may not be prosecuted. But it does not mean that there are not violations of international criminal law and other international law elements in these particular actions on the part of the U.S. government.
Yeah, you're right. The US is not part of the Rome Statute, but neither were Israel or Russia, but the courts did go after their leaders. Do you foresee perhaps actions against US officials, including President Donald Trump, if this escalates further?
I mean, I will not. I don't want to speculate on what the court will do, but there are, of course, I'm sure they must be monitoring the situation. But I would like to go back to the earlier point that I was making, that we are moving towards a situation of a world disorder. And in a time of a crisis like this, there's also an opportunity for countries to come together and create a better world disorder, which is based on fairness. Because one of the key principles of the UN Charter is territorial integrity, but also the equality of all countries. So merely because one country is so powerful and another country is not that powerful, both in terms of political, economic, and military-wise, that should not be that should not give a license to the powerful country to infringe the territorial integrity of another country. So sovereign equality is a core principle. And it is time that the states come together to stand against these violations, systemic violations, I would say, on the part of one powerful country. Because today it could be Venezuela, tomorrow it could be some other country. And I think this has to be stopped because then it creates a situation of impunity where might becomes the right. The whole idea of creating the UN as an institution and the whole international architecture after the Second World War, especially, was to create a peace and establish a rule of law order. And what we have seen this year under the leadership of President Trump, is a slow but concerted dismantling of that international order that has been built for decades.
Right. Now, on that point that you made, I wonder what's the message that is being sent to smaller nations, or perhaps who are not in the Security Council, by these strikes? Because if you look at countries in the Security Council, Russia is having its way in Ukraine. The United States is clearly having its way in Venezuela, and if you look at American allies like Israel, they had their way in Gaza as well. So the system is clearly working for those big powers, and that they're able to do whatever they want, but it's not really working for those countries who are not in the big boys club. What message does that send to these smaller countries?
I mean, the message is very clear that those who are powerful, they can get away with the violations of international law. So that creates a sense of lawlessness. But the point I would like to make is that the powers don't stay perpetually in the same position. the wheel will turn around. The countries that were historically very powerful in the past, they are not that powerful at this particular point of time. So the power balance is already shifting. It will definitely take some more years and decades, but definitely we are going to move towards a situation in the world in which there will be multiple centers of power. And then it will not be easy for one country to disrupt the international order like this.
Right.
There will be consequences.
Right. Now, just coming briefly back to Venezuela, I know you've studied this well, and that's why I ask you, even though it's a speculative question, why do you think the Trump administration is doing this? Because there have been several theories floating around. Some say it is indeed because of the drugs. Others say it's because he wants to appease his domestic base, which is in favor of stricter action on these countries. Some say it's because of the oil, and that Trump is eyeing the oil resources of Venezuela. And there are yet others who say it's about regime change, about toppling Maduro at the end of the day. What, in your assessment, after studying this conflict, is the real goal here?
I mean, it should be the U.S. administration answering this question more clearly
Unfortunately,
and with
they're
authority. But from my perspective, it seems there are some ulterior motive here. And the facade is that the government is trying to deal with drug trafficking. But if you look at the evidence and the data that has been provided by the UN office on these particular drug trafficking situations, Venezuela may be a transit point, may be contributing, but there are other countries in the region that may be playing a more critical role in drug trafficking rather than Venezuela. So targeting Venezuela for this particular thing looks driven by certain other hidden agenda, whatever that could be. It could be that they would like to change the regime. It could be that they would like to put pressure on the government and have some kind of a deal in relation to the oil. So all these possibilities are there, and it's for the U.S. government to unpack those motives rather than for us. But definitely from our perspective, this is a breach of international law. This is in violation of UN Charter. And this creates a sense of lawlessness and irresponsibility globally. And that's why this must stop. And it's the responsibility of other states to come together to stop it, in my view. They must take political steps. They must take diplomatic steps. There could be a session of the Human Rights Council that can be convened that focuses specifically on the actions of the U.S. government, not just in relation to Venezuela, but whatever U.S. government has done over the last 11 months. That is definitely very significant damage to the international order. I also wonder that in future, the countries also need to consider whether the U.S. government has any legitimacy to host the UN headquarters anymore.
Right.
If a U.S. government continues to do these kind of steps, then it raises those legitimate questions that we should be asking.
Right. Well, a lot of important points you mentioned there, including things for a long-term discussion about the world order and the United States and the United Nations and the role that it plays. Your report, authored by you and the other UN experts last week, was an important step in calling out the US aggression in the Caribbean. Unfortunately, Washington is not heeding your warnings, and they've gone a step ahead and struck mainland Venezuela. We'll see how this conflict unfolds. We hope that better sense prevails in the Caribbean. But thank you so much, Professor, for speaking to us on Firstpost.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Want the facts?
The latest developments?
News that gets straight to the point.
Well, we've got all three just for you. This is Firstpost Live, a brand new show, your window into what really matters.
Don't miss it.